Lady Bird and Lyndon Johnson are remembered as one of the great political love stories of the 20th century. A whirlwind Texas courtship, 90 devoted letters exchanged in just 10 weeks, and a marriage that carried a shy country girl all the way to the White House at her husband's side for 39 years. If you're into this kind of close-sourced history, go ahead and subscribe now because there's a lot more ground to cover. Almost every detail in that summary is true. What it leaves out is a husband whose biographer has documented affairs lasting the better part of 3 decades, one relationship serious enough that even that biographer couldn't bring himself to look his subject's widow in the eye while asking about it, a pattern of public humiliation friends said they never understood how she tolerated. Several miscarriages absorbed largely in private before either of her daughters was born, and a wife who built, by every account, a genuinely remarkable life and legacy of her own specifically by learning, with real discipline, how not to look directly at what her marriage actually contained. Claudia Alta Taylor was born on December 22, 1912, in Karnak, Texas, the daughter of a domineering, self-made businessman locally known as Mr. Boss, who controlled 15,000 acres of cotton and ran the town's general stores under a sign reading simply, "Dealer in Everything." Her nickname came from a nursemaid who declared the toddler as pretty as a ladybird, a name she reportedly disliked at first and then carried for the rest of her life anyway. Her mother, Minnie, a bookish woman who never felt at home in rural East Texas, fell down the stairs of the family home while several months pregnant in 1918 and died days later. Lady Bird was 5 and later said her clearest surviving memory of her mother was watching her on her deathbed. She was raised afterward largely by an aunt who moved in to help, in a household she later described to a biographer, without much softening, as her strong-willed father's own whole feudal way of life. Lady Bird herself later called her own childhood very lonely, saying it was during those solitary years that she first developed the love of reading and the quiet appreciation for the natural world around her that would eventually shape her entire public legacy. Johnson's own childhood offered a working template for exactly the kind of household he'd eventually build with Lady Bird. His parents, Sam Ely Johnson Jr., a Texas state legislator and sometime cotton speculator, and Rebecca Baines, a college-educated schoolteacher's daughter descended from a line of ministers and public officials, married in 1907, and Sam's finances collapsed disastrously within a year, wiping out his cotton holdings and leaving the family deeply in debt for years afterward. Rebecca, by her own later account, grew frustrated and disappointed with both the poverty and the sheer isolation of hill country farm life, a marriage she'd entered expecting culture and stability and instead found consumed by hardship. She poured that disappointment specifically into her eldest son, coaching him relentlessly on his schoolwork and pushing him toward exactly the kind of outsized ambition and self-belief that would define his entire adult personality. Lyndon Johnson, in other words, learned the basic shape of a marriage, a wife absorbing a husband's failures while investing everything she had left into her children's future, years before he ever met the woman who would spend her own life living out nearly the same arrangement. She met Lyndon Johnson in Austin in the summer of 1934, introduced by a mutual friend while Johnson, then a 26-year-old congressional aide, was technically in town to see someone else entirely. He asked her to breakfast the next morning instead. The breakfast turned into an entire day driving around Austin together, and by sundown, Johnson had already proposed marriage. Lady Bird, 21 and freshly graduated from the University of Texas with 2 degrees, thought he was, in her own later words, out of his mind. The man proposing marriage on a first date had been announcing outsized ambitions since childhood. Robert Caro has recounted a story from Johnson's own youth in which a 12-year-old Lyndon told his playmates, with total confidence, that he was someday going to be President of the United States. When the other children told him they wouldn't vote for him, he reportedly shot back that he wouldn't need their votes at all. It's a small anecdote, but biographers have returned to it repeatedly as an early preview of a personality that would define the entire marriage to come. Total certainty about his own destiny, and very little apparent concern for whether the people around him were actually on board with it. Johnson returned to Washington the next day and began a genuine written siege, sending nearly 90 letters over the following 10 weeks. "I love you, only you," he wrote in September. "Want to always love, only you." Lady Bird, more cautious by nature and hearing plenty of relatives urging her to wait, wrote back that his proposal had rather put her on the spot, adding, in a line she'd repeat for the cameras decades later, that she loved him, she just didn't know how everlastingly. 10 weeks after they'd met, Johnson showed up at her father's house in Karnak to demand an answer in person. She said yes, and the two of them drove nearly 400 miles to San Antonio to, as Lady Bird put it herself, commit matrimony. Johnson had forgotten to arrange a wedding ring, so a friend serving as the local postmaster ran out and bought one from a nearby Sears, Roebuck for $2.50, just in time for the ceremony at St. Mark's Episcopal Church on November 17, 1934. The presiding minister reportedly shook his head afterward, doubting a marriage assembled this quickly could possibly last. If you're hooked already, the subscribe button is right there, and it genuinely helps get the next one made. The minister's skepticism wasn't entirely unfounded, even if the marriage itself outlasted it. By his biographer Robert Caro's own account, the young Lyndon Johnson had a well-established reputation among college friends for crude, constant boasting about his sexual conquests, referring to his own anatomy by the nickname Jumbo and telling his brother things like, "Well, I gotta take old Jumbo here and give him some exercise. I wonder who I'll do tonight." Caro found much of this early bragging exaggerated to the point of outright fabrication, driven less by actual conquest than by an insecure young man's need to be seen as powerful in every possible arena at once. The instinct underneath it, treating sex as something to perform and boast about rather than something bound up with any particular loyalty, would prove considerably less exaggerated once the marriage was actually underway. Lady Bird's own contributions to the marriage started almost immediately and went well beyond the emotional. When a Texas congressional seat opened unexpectedly in February 1937, Johnson wanted to run, but worried he lacked the money to compete. Lady Bird drew on an inheritance from her late mother and handed him $10,000 on the spot, funding that let him be the first candidate to formally declare and helped carry him through a grueling 42-day campaign to victory. She hated the campaign trail itself, by her own later admission, criticizing her own shyness harshly, while her husband worked every room with total ease. It was the first of what would become a lifelong pattern, Lady Bird supplying the money, the discipline, and eventually the actual professional infrastructure that made Lyndon Johnson's career possible, while he supplied the ambition and, increasingly, very little of the loyalty that might reasonably have been expected in return. Motherhood came slowly and painfully. Lady Bird suffered 3 separate miscarriages through the late 1930s and early 1940s, absorbed largely in private, before finally carrying a pregnancy to term with the birth of her first daughter, Linda, in 1944, followed by a second, Lucy, in 1947. Doctors at the time reportedly warned her that continued campaigning and the stress of political life were putting each pregnancy at real risk, advice that ran directly against the demands of the career she was simultaneously helping finance and build. She kept campaigning anyway through some of the same losses, in a household where her own body's toll rarely factored into anyone's public account of the marriage at all. Around 1937, the same year Lady Bird bankrolled his first campaign, Johnson began an affair with a woman named Alice Glass, a strikingly tall Texas socialite Lady Bird had known slightly at the University of Texas. Alice was, at the time, the mistress and soon-to-be wife of Charles Marsh, a wealthy newspaper publisher and one of Johnson's most important political backers, which meant Johnson was risking his own career, not just his marriage, every time he visited her at Marsh's Virginia estate Longley. According to Caro, the relationship lasted in some form for roughly 25 years, though the physical part of it likely ended after 2 or 3. Alice possessed real political judgment, and Johnson leaned on her advice for years after any romance had cooled, in a friendship neither of them ever fully let go of. What set the Glass affair apart from Johnson's countless other, more forgettable encounters wasn't just its length. It was how little effort he made to hide it. Lady Bird's own obituary in The Guardian, published on her death in 2007, described Johnson as so casual about the affair and about a separate relationship with the California Congresswoman Helen Gahagan Douglas that his wife was left openly humiliated by it, in full view of the political and social circles both of them moved through. Douglas was in her own right one of the more formidable women in American politics of the era, a former Broadway and film actress turned 3-term congresswoman from California, later famously defeated in a brutally sexist 1950 Senate campaign by Richard Nixon. Caro chose to document her relationship with Johnson in detail for the same reason he documented Alice Glass, not because it was simply another conquest, but because Douglas, like Glass, was a genuine political peer, someone whose company Johnson sought out for reasons that went beyond the purely physical, even as the arrangement cost his wife precisely the same public dignity each time. Robert Caro, who spent decades interviewing everyone connected to Johnson's life for his multi-volume biography, has described the specific discomfort of finally sitting down with Lady Bird herself and asking about Alice Glass. He recalled that as she spoke, admiringly, about a woman who had almost certainly slept with her husband for years, he found he couldn't bring himself to look up from his notes. "It's the only interview in his entire career," he said, where he didn't ask a single follow-up question, simply because he couldn't bear to press a woman that directly on a wound she'd spent 70 years managing, not to discuss out loud. What people who actually knew Lady Bird kept coming back to, again and again, was less her pain than her sheer discipline in not appearing to feel it. She reportedly continued having Alice Glass over socially, including for brunch, knowing exactly what the relationship had been. A biographer who spent years working closely with her, Michael Gillette, later wrote that Lady Bird never once discussed her husband's affairs in her own official oral history, since she'd have considered doing so both embarrassing and disloyal, though she privately admitted to him that she sometimes tried to improve herself by studying the other women Linden found appealing. Asked once directly about Alice Glass specifically, in one of the only moments Gillette ever heard her offer anything resembling criticism of another person, her composure slipped, just slightly, before resetting almost immediately. Caro has also been direct about the uglier, more public side of the marriage, Johnson's habit of comparing his wife unfavorably to other women in front of guests, most notably Nellie Connolly, the strikingly attractive wife of Texas Governor John Connolly, at parties where Lady Bird was expected to simply absorb the comparison in real time. Nellie herself later told Caro she never understood how Lady Bird stood it. Caro has called Johnson's treatment of his wife abusive enough that it became something close to common knowledge among their own friends, delivered loudly, in public, to a woman whose defining personal trait, by nearly everyone's account, was a genuine, lifelong dread of exactly that kind of scene. What Lady Bird endured privately was, by every account, simply the domestic version of a management style Johnson applied to nearly everyone who worked for him. One Washington insiders eventually nicknamed the Johnson treatment, looming physically over people, since he stood 6'3" and used the height deliberately, mixing flattery, intimidation, and sheer volume until the other person simply gave in. A psychiatrist who observed Johnson at close range, Dr. Bertram Brown, later described his habit of humiliating employees as a direct exercise of power, calling him a man of such narcissism that he genuinely believed he could do anything to anyone around him. Lady Bird wasn't a special case within that pattern. She was, in a real sense, simply the person who had signed up to absorb the most concentrated, most permanent version of it. The Alice Glass relationship finally broke apart for reasons that had none. By Caro's account, Alice grew increasingly opposed to the Vietnam War as Johnson escalated it through the mid-1960s, eventually calling it one of history's errors, and the political rift proved stronger than whatever bond had survived every previous decade. Alice later told friends she'd burned Johnson's old love letters, not out of any lingering shame about the affair itself, but because she didn't want her own grandchildren discovering she'd once been close to the man she'd come to hold responsible for the war. Lady Bird's guardedness about all of this held firm almost to the very end of her life. The biographer Jan Jarboe Russell spent 3 years interviewing her for a 1999 book, with Lady Bird's full cooperation, until Russell finally pressed her directly about the Glass affair. Mrs. Johnson, then 86, sent back an icy letter ending the interviews altogether. Whatever peace she'd made privately with 50 years of her husband's infidelity, she had clearly not made peace with narrating it for a stranger's book. Away from the marriage's private wounds, Lady Bird built something concrete and entirely her own. She personally purchased a small, struggling Austin radio station, KTBC, in 1943, using more of her own inheritance, and through sheer persistence and hard-won FCC approvals, including securing a rare Clear Channel license, grew it into a broadcasting empire spanning radio and television that made the Johnsons genuinely wealthy independent of politics altogether. An operation Lady Bird ran with real, direct authority as its own registered owner and manager, rather than as a passive spouse lending her name to it. Johnson himself, watching her operate, once told friends that voters would happily have elected her over him, a compliment that was very likely also true. As First Lady, she became the first to run her own press operation and take a solo national campaign tour through the South in 1964, an 8-state whistle-stop trip undertaken specifically because her husband's own aides worried a woman's gentler public presence might do more to calm racial tensions in the region than another Johnson speech could. Her highway beautification campaign, dismissed by some critics at the time as a hobby for a president's wife concerned mainly with wildflowers, produced real federal legislation, the Highway Beautification Act of 1965, and eventually a wildflower research center in Texas that still bears her name today. The 1964 tour itself was considerably more dangerous than the phrase whistle-stop campaign suggests. Traveling aboard a 19-car train nicknamed the Lady Bird Special, accompanied by her own daughters, Linda and Lucy, and more than 150 reporters, Lady Bird covered 1,600 miles across 8 southern states in 4 days, deliberately visiting the exact towns her husband's own aides had judged too dangerous for the president himself to appear in, following his signature on the Civil Rights Act that summer. She reportedly told her staff outright to give her the tough towns, and in Charleston, South Carolina, hecklers drowned out her speech entirely, with one man telling a reporter the president was a communist, using a racial slur to explain that his real objection was to civil rights for Black Americans. Her longtime aide, Liz Carpenter, later noted that by 1964, anyone could visit Atlanta and speak in favor of civil rights and leave unscathed. Lady Bird had specifically chosen the places where that wasn't true. It's difficult to reconcile the woman who absorbed her own husband's public humiliations without complaint for 30 years with the same woman who calmly walked into hostile, jeering crowds because the campaign needed someone willing to do it. Both, apparently, were simply Lady Bird. That 1964 tour was, in truth, only the most dramatic entry in a much longer pattern. During the 1960 presidential campaign, Lady Bird personally logged an estimated 35,000 miles stumping for the Kennedy-Johnson ticket across the country, and once Johnson became vice president, she served as an active goodwill ambassador in her own right, visiting 33 foreign countries on his behalf over the following 3 years. A level of independent, sustained diplomatic travel no previous vice president's wife had really attempted. The vice presidency itself was by most accounts a genuinely humiliating stretch for Johnson personally, a former Senate Majority Leader reduced to a largely ceremonial role and, according to Robert Kennedy's own private remarks, treated by parts of the Kennedy circle as something close to an unwelcome usurper inside their own administration. Lady Bird absorbed that indignity too, the same way she'd absorbed nearly everything else, by simply finding more work to do. The marriage's old pattern of Lady Bird managing crisis while Lyndon supplied the drama reasserted itself sharply in July 1955, when Johnson, then Senate Majority Leader, suffered a serious heart attack at 46. Lady Bird managed his recovery, his diet, and his return to public life with the same disciplined competence she'd applied to a struggling radio station and a husband's wandering attention alike. Evidence of a partnership that, whatever else it was, never stopped functioning as an actual working partnership when it mattered most. That partnership faced its single most public test on November 22, 1963, when Johnson, riding 2 cars behind President Kennedy in the Dallas motorcade, suddenly became president himself in the space of a single gunshot. Lady Bird was in the car directly behind her husband's, close enough to hear Nellie Connolly, the same friend Johnson had spent years unfavorably comparing his own wife to, lean toward the president moments before the shots rang out and say, brightly, "You can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Lady Bird began her own White House diary that same day with the line, "It all began so beautifully," and later gave a strikingly composed, detailed oral account of the assassination and its immediate aftermath, including standing beside Jacqueline Kennedy on Air Force One as Johnson took the oath of office less than 2 hours after the shooting. Whatever the marriage's private failures, the transition itself showed the same competence under pressure Lady Bird had been quietly supplying for nearly 30 years, now performed in front of the entire country at once. That first entry began a habit Lady Bird kept up almost daily for the next 5 years, dictating her recollections into a tape recorder, often working from a manila envelope of that day's schedule, menus, and clippings to jog her memory before she spoke. By the time Johnson left office in January 1969, the recordings totaled roughly 123 hours and an estimated 1.75 million words, a private, contemporaneous record of the presidency kept entirely in her own voice. She described walking into the role in the diary's opening entry with a line that captured the whole abrupt transition in a single image. She felt, she said, like she was walking onto a stage for a part she had never rehearsed. She trimmed the full recordings by roughly a factor of 7 to publish an 800-page book, A White House Diary, in 1970, and sealed the complete unedited tapes until after her own death, which meant the fullest version of her own account of the marriage and the presidency stayed private for nearly 4 decades longer than either of the two people it was actually about. The presidency that followed asked even more of her than the transition itself. As the Vietnam War dragged into the mid-1960s without any resolution in sight, Johnson's own mental state deteriorated in ways multiple people close to him documented independently. His press secretary, Bill Moyers, described a pronounced, prolonged depression that would sometimes swallow the president whole, saying he would simply disappear inward, morose, self-pitying, and angry, adding flatly that he was a tormented man. Moyers recalled fielding worried phone calls from cabinet members about the president's state of mind. The historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, who worked directly in his White House before becoming his biographer, wrote that Johnson grew unrestrained and reckless during this period, constructing a private fantasy world of heroes and villains that left staff frightened by what looked, to them, like genuine paranoia. Lady Bird lived inside that same White House throughout, managing a public schedule of her own while quietly absorbing whatever version of her husband happened to walk through the door each evening. The war's toll reached Lady Bird directly, not just secondhand through her husband's moods. In October 1967, speaking at Williams College in Massachusetts, she was met by student protesters loud enough to disrupt the event, a scene her own audio diary later recorded in detail as part of the private record she was keeping of exactly how the war was reshaping her own public life. By that point in the presidency, campus protests, hostile crowds, and open hecklers had become a near-constant feature of her public appearances, a far cry from the composed, universally admired figure who'd once been able to walk into hostile southern towns and, at minimum, be heard out. The same war eating away at her husband's mental state was, simultaneously, eating away at whatever protection her own popularity had once offered her. The fuller picture that eventually emerged from those diary tapes, once historians finally gained real access to them starting in 2013, complicated the passive, genteel image Lady Bird had spent decades allowing the public to settle on. The historian Julia Zweig, who spent years working through all 123 hours of the recordings for a 2021 biography, concluded that Lady Bird had actually functioned as one of Johnson's most trusted political advisors, offering direct feedback on speeches, policy, and staffing decisions throughout the presidency, a role Zweig argued made her something closer to a bridge between Eleanor Roosevelt's public activism and the more overtly political first ladies who followed decades later. It's a striking correction to layer on top of everything else. The same woman absorbing her husband's affairs and public humiliations without complaint was, during business hours, one of the more consequential unelected voices inside his entire administration. That influence reached its single highest stakes moment on March 31, 1968, the night Johnson announced he wouldn't run for re-election. By multiple later accounts, Lady Bird was directly involved in shaping the speech itself, and she reportedly insisted the address include a specific, unambiguous phrase rather than anything vaguer or more easily walked back. "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." It's a small editorial insistence with enormous consequences, closing off any future temptation to re-enter the race once the speech had actually aired. And it's difficult to imagine a clearer piece of evidence that the woman managing the household's private wounds for 3 decades was, at the exact same time, entrusted with locking down the most consequential single sentence of her husband's entire political career. Amid the war's mounting toll, the family still had 2 genuine celebrations. Lutzy married Patrick Nugent in a Catholic nuptial mass at Washington's National Shrine in August 1966. A conversion and a wedding Lady Bird herself asked an aide to carefully document for the LBJ Library's own records, treating even her own daughter's happiest day as something worth preserving for the historical account. Linda followed in December 1967, marrying Chuck Robb, a Marine captain in the White House itself, the first wedding held there in more than 50 years. Both marriages briefly gave the exhausted, increasingly embattled household something to celebrate that had nothing to do with Vietnam, approval ratings, or any of the private arithmetic Lady Bird had spent 3 decades quietly managing. Johnson chose not to seek re-election in 1968, worn down by the Vietnam War he'd escalated and the growing unrest it produced at home, and the couple retired to their Texas ranch. He died there of a heart attack on January 22, 1973, at 64. Lady Bird lived another 34 years, remaining active in conservation and public life, founding the National Wildflower Research Center in 1982 and continuing to make public appearances well into her 80s. A stroke in 2002 left her increasingly unable to speak, first managing occasional short phrases and eventually communicating only by writing or facial expression, though she still got outdoors to walk among the wildflowers whenever her health allowed it. She died at her Austin home on July 11, 2007, at 94, of natural causes, surrounded by family, as a Catholic priest summoned by her daughter Lucci administered last rites, even though Lady Bird herself had been raised and remained Episcopalian her entire life. She was buried 2 days later beside Lyndon at the family cemetery on the old LBJ Ranch in Stonewall, Texas, the same hill country both of their own families had struggled through generations earlier. His very last documented conversation wasn't with Lady Bird at all, but with Doris Kearns Goodwin, who received an early morning call from him 2 days before he died. He sounded, she later recalled, incredibly sad, having just read a biography of Lincoln that left him worried ordinary people would eventually forget him entirely. When she tried to reassure him, he cut her off abruptly and told her instead to get married, have children, and spend real time with them, adding that he wished he'd done more of that himself, since it was a kind of legacy that mattered more than the public one he'd spent his entire life chasing. It was the last thing he ever said to her. Lady Bird lived another 34 years, remaining active in conservation and public life well into her 90s, before dying on July 11, 2007, at 94. She never remarried, and she never gave a full public accounting of the marriage's private cost either, choosing instead, as she had for 70 years, to let her own considerable body of work speak for the version of the story she was actually willing to tell. It might be a more accurate one than the letters alone ever suggested. Two people who stayed bound to each other for 39 years, for reasons that had less to do with everlasting devotion, and considerably more to do with what each of them was willing to keep quiet about, on the record and off it, in exchange for what the other one provided.